I'll feel those. That's not an
Okay,
issue.
great.
All right, and we are live. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers around the world. Thanks so much for joining us for another edition of our Friday Fireside Chat. So, this time we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are going to be speaking to George Kamide. Hi, George.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick introduction. George Kamide is the co-founder and co-host of the Bare Knuckles and Brass Tacks, a podcast dedicated to repairing the vendor-customer trust divide in cybersecurity. He has over 10 years of experience in marketing, social media, digital strategy, and project management. With experience in large language models and security detections, George has led panel discussions on the intersection of security and AI tooling and also consults independently with companies on AI business strategies. He also sits on the advisory board of For Vision and Voice, a community dedicated to uplifting women into cyber leadership positions. So thank you so much for joining us, George.
Yeah, happy to be
Yeah,
here.
yeah, glad to have you. So before we get started, I'd just like to remind our viewers that as usual, we do have a giveaway happening right now, but this one is bigger than usual. Rather than going for the bundles, we are giving away an entire AppSecEngineer Pro subscription today. So if you go into our description in either YouTube or LinkedIn, you're going to find a link to a Google form. You can leave your details with us over there, your email and your name, and we will reach out to one lucky winner who will be winning a whole year's worth of access to all the courses, all challenges, and all playgrounds on AppSec Engineer. It's an amazing deal. So you better grab that, before the time runs out. So we will be announcing the winner on our next edition of the Friday Fireside Chat. So look forward to that. Awesome. So shall we get
Absolutely.
started, George?
Let's do it.
Awesome. So, my first question to you is, we're fresh off the heels of Black Hat USA and DEF CON. I didn't get to go to DEF CON, but I had a great time attending Black Hat. We had a bunch of trainings there, and I got to meet some old acquaintances and made a ton of new friends. So, what was your experience like at the conference this year? And if there was one thing that stood out most to you this time, what would it be?
Yeah, so I was in Vegas for the full week, Sunday to Sunday. Yeah, so I was at B-Sides, Black Hat, SquadCon, and DEF CON. I think, well, one, I was there for the first time as not with a vendor as an employee, so I was there on my own. But I think what really stood out to me was just the ability to meet people that you've been in conversation with, either indirectly via LinkedIn or maybe directly via email or some collaborations for the first time in person. And that's just a real highlight because whatever that amount of time is, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, you can
Mhm.
establish a real connection that goes beyond
Right.
those online relationships. And you really got to share ideas and came away with some, possible collaborations on papers and presentations. And that's just really exciting. And
Mhm.
it's priceless. It's really hard to do that online.
Absolutely. Yeah, honestly, like the Black Hat was online a few years ago, right? And I think
Yeah.
that created a lot of problems in just in terms of the ability for people to meet. And I've been part of the booth the last couple of years,
Hmm.
and that has been an invaluable experience for us. You know, whether or not it really, whether or not it gives something back to you in the business, it's always important to stay visible, right? It's
Yeah.
important to stay in people's minds and have conversations, and also kind of just learn what people are talking about, what people are, interested in at the moment. It kind of gives you a bit of an insight into the industry as well. It's not just about, making a mark.
For sure. And if you've been in the industry long enough, and long enough can be
Hmm.
as little as 2 years, I mean, things like
Yeah.
RSA and Black Hat, these big tentpole conferences are an opportunity to see those friends. You may only see them twice a year, but you may be scattered
Yeah.
in many directions. And so it's also a good time. Yeah. And I will say, and maybe we'll come back to this, but I think
Hmm.
being there on my own, I was a little bit closer to the social scene than the social
Yeah.
scene catered by a vendor. And I
Hmm.
do want to say the one thing that stood out to me, in addition to the generosity, I think we also need to confront as an industry the more disturbing side of relatively rampant sexual harassment, either directly
Oh.
against individuals or in sexualized marketing. And I just want to put
Mm-hmm.
that out there, not as like the downer, but it is something that
Yeah.
has stayed with me and is something that everyone needs to call out when we see it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's you are part of the vision and voice, right? The community for uplifting women in cyber, and
Yeah,
I think that's something that all of us should get involved in, right? To some degree, at
absolutely.
least.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're really clued into the AI ML space, and that's something that's really blowing up right now. As you know, since I was on the expo floor, I was seeing a lot more companies this
Yeah.
year who are in some way involved in AI, machine learning, that sort of thing. So, particularly with regard to cybersecurity and red teaming, that's something that you especially are, clued into. And I'm someone who is not super familiar with the security aspect of AI. So I'd love to know how exactly artificial intelligence features into security activities.
Yeah. So I want to be clear. Machine learning as a subdiscipline of artificial intelligence has been a part of security tooling for many years now, simply because there's no way to handle the
Hmm.
volume of detections and alerts and just really even digest like the volume of log data, right, without machine learning. So it's been there for a while, but I think what's new, because we've entered, what could be called maybe the AI 3.0 era, is the advent of generative AI. And
Hmm.
then what that does for security teams, for the most part, right now, it's been changes and innovations in the UI, like the tools that you're going to use. You may no longer
Hmm.
have to write SQL scripts or KQL scripts, that you may have
Right.
to just be able to ask the machine, like, please reverse engineer this, or what is in this email metadata, and just being able to
Hmm.
basically converse with your tooling. That's going to be really big for security teams, and it will really impact process. On the
Hmm.
In the interest of AppSecEngineer, we have things like GitHub Copilot, and
Right.
where coders are using it to supplement their efforts to build out or insert libraries and do stuff that they don't want to work on, but then they can come back and
Yeah.
review the code. I think there's a similar role there to play with AI, basically going through the code and looking for possible vulnerabilities, which may have to be escalated and remediated eventually by humans, but being able to
Hmm.
take a lot of the review and QA process off the load. But then I think the bigger picture, which we have not yet reached, but we are probably just entering this phase, is the availability of the technology for companies, individual enterprises, to either build on existing open source models, model their own internal data. When I say that, I mean not just network telemetry, I mean HR data, revenue data, like create an AI model of their entire business.
Hmm.
Think that's going to dramatically change the scope of what InfoSec teams are working on, because now you're not only protecting the business from external threats, but there's going to be a bigger role for DevSecOps and reviewing the machinery that is propelling the business forward, because that is going to be basically constantly changing intelligent code. And that just
Right.
kind of opens up a whole new frontier. Mostly InfoSec teams have been sitting on the inside, protecting from uh,
Hmm.
from external threats, and now you're going to get closer to protecting business process, which is generating revenue, which has a lot more risk attached to it.
Right. And
I know
I'd
I do want to,
imagine,
sorry, I did want
yeah.
to circle back. The benefit of all of this is that I
Hmm.
do think red teaming as a discipline and even as a basic term is now much more widely understood, right? There's very little
Hmm.
press coverage about foundational models like ChatGPT or Llama or whatever without discussion of what red teaming is, and I think that's going to play a very vital role going forward.
Right. That's a great point. And in fact, I was thinking that, maybe AI and machine learning could probably factor into things like supply chain security,
Mhm.
building, the software supply chain, the S bombs and all of that.
Yeah,
So I would imagine that AI could really factor into a lot of, more deeply rooted aspects of DevSecOps and the software development pipeline.
absolutely.
So, yeah. So if there's trying to move away from the technical questions for a little bit. If there's one thing a nerdy or introverted person hates to do, it's going to networking events and meeting new people. And that's something that I have, had a little bit of difficulty over the last few years. So that's something that I'm trying to, get a little bit more used to. But as a thought leader and entrepreneur, that's kind of your bread and butter, right? Do you ever find that process difficult? And what are some tips you can give to a budding professional, especially in security, on effectively making connections and building relationships in the industry?
Yeah, I also want to be very clear and set the record straight. I hate small talk. I really
Yeah.
hate conversations that start with "What do you do?"
Hmm.
But at the same time, the power of your personal network cannot be understated. And let me
Yeah.
just illustrate with a very clear example, right? I was part of a wave of layoffs in mid-May, and it is
Hmm.
basically through my network that I was able to get any hot lead on jobs. Applications kind of go into a black hole,
Hmm.
but I was immediately able to back channel to my network and get introductions and stuff like that. And that's invaluable. And if you don't have that, it's really hard
Hmm.
to move quickly if you have a job change situation. But when it comes to networking, I have always hated the term because it feels really smarmy. It feels like you're glad
Yeah.
handing and you're sort of always angling.
Hmm.
So what I've just trying to do is make genuine connections based on shared interests. So for
Hmm.
example, I use LinkedIn in a particular way, which is really just to think through some things out loud. It's a lot of news here, a lot of podcasts there, and I'm just sort of the gears are turning, and I might be thinking something, and I would just write it and I put it out there, and eventually you start to get some of the same people liking, sharing, commenting, and then I would
Yeah.
connect with them and then interact with them, and it becomes an asynchronous conversation over many months, but eventually you build these relationships in such a way that you may be at a conference and then people are like, hey, are you going to Black Hat, are you going to GurCon, whatever,
Yeah.
and then you can meet up, and that way is a lot easier, and it's going to feel more natural than just walking into a room cold with a name tag that says hello,
Hmm.
my name is George, and just trying to introduce yourself, because that level of networking, you're really just going to hit the surface. So what I
Yeah.
would say to anyone beginning is, be active. It's not a one-way street. You have to reciprocate, give, and the more you give to this community, the more it kind of comes back around to you. But also
Hmm.
wherever you can meet up in real life, right? There's local meetups, there are local chapters of ISSA, for example. So it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be these gigantic conferences with 25,000 people. You
Yeah.
just need to start building that up, because the more people you meet, the more they introduce you to other friends, and just that is the network effect, is you sort of
Yeah.
cascade your relationships.
Exactly. Yeah, and if you have like a local OWASP chapter or something like that,
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
great place to meet people, and on a small scale, because that's when you can really, just talk to people and just have
Absolutely.
conversations without the worry that there's going to be 100 things you're going to miss because you're having that one conversation. Because that's always the worry that we have, right?
Yeah, and for the most part, these local communities are very giving and rewarding of curiosity. So if you show up and
Yeah.
you're self-conscious that you're new or you're just learning, there's a lot of people there who remember that time, and they're very
Yep.
giving and very generous. And also there are, for every discipline in cyber, red team, whatever, there are, thousands of Discord servers where you can get involved.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can end up
Absolutely.
meeting some of those people in real life too.
That's great. That's always community building, networking. That's something that a lot of people tend, especially in the tech space, tend to kind of shy away from. But it's just so important to
Yeah.
to your the bottom line of your career and in general of your social life in the industry, that it's kind of something
Yeah,
that you
and it's
need to.
important to have peers, because your
Yep.
family and your local friends, they are your support network for really hard
Mhm.
times. But they
Yeah.
don't know what it's like to struggle for a certification test, or they don't know
Yeah.
what it's like to be in maybe a toxic environment inside of a SOC, or that you are in incident response and you're really thinking
Hmm.
about moving over to, they aren't dealing with those same issues, and so it's really hard to get the
Totally.
feedback or the advice that you might want on those things.
Exactly. Yeah. So, we just spoke about how AI and machine learning are used for security activities like red teaming, but can it be leveraged by actual malicious actors?
Yeah.
I've heard of it being used for phishing attacks and such, but how exactly does that work?
Yeah, the fear around phishing is that, to date, phishing scams either are mass blast, like everyone in the organization gets the free gift card email, and it's pretty easy to spot, and email filters are pretty good about spotting that now. Now, what generative AI allows you to do is to get really personalized at scale. So to date,
Okay.
it's been either phishing is broad and spear phishing is very targeted, but generative AI would give threat actors the ability to do spear phishing at scale, right? You can, um, study using OSINT particular targets inside of a company. Lately, the attack is to get into the email through compromised credentials and kind of wait midstream. So you have like 7 people on an email thread, and then you jump in so that you appear more legitimate. But even if I don't
Oh,
speak
okay.
English natively, for example, or Portuguese or whatever my
Right.
target is, I can use generative AI to get pretty close. I
Yep.
can get really enough that the person may not wait that half second before they click on the link or they transfer the money. Now that is
Yep.
sort of like, okay, pretty basic stuff. And we have
Yep.
seen weaponized versions of GPT models. We had Worm GPT, which has since been replaced by, it's literally called Evil GPT. Now, if you marry that with phishing as a service kits, you get this really fast commodified pipeline for attacks where the barrier to entry is very low. So threat actors don't
Right.
need a really sophisticated technical expertise. So what that tells me is that you may see more entrants from yet more organized crime groups that can just put bodies in seats, and they can, one person can work several campaigns at once. Again,
Right.
that feels like just kind of 101 level threat acting with this particular
Mm-hmm.
technology. My greater fear is malware that is attached to open source reinforcement learning algorithms in such a way that it will learn what the individual environment is for a particular target. So as an example, today
Okay.
malware, like most software, is hard coded. This piece of malware
Right.
does this. And right, we understand the TTPs. It does a side loader attack, or it moves laterally in this way through this part of the network. But imagine a
Yep.
malware that hits, for example, a large financial service company, pings the network, studies, learns, and then ex- executes in one way versus maybe a
Mm-hmm.
CPG or a retailer, same malware, but does something completely different. That level of dynamism
Wow.
makes defense very tricky, right? And I think
Right.
that's
Yeah.
why we saw DARPA putting out this contest for people to develop sophisticated AI defenses like self-repairing software or stuff
Mm-hmm.
that basically automatically spot these vulnerabilities and respond in as dynamic a fashion.
Oh wow. Yeah. I mean, the that sort of self writing malware, that sounds extremely scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because especially because the whole context aware sort of aspect of these large learning models. That's the real fear, right? Because they can kind of understand on whatever level that how exactly the network works or how exactly
Yes.
that piece of software works, and change their systems accordingly. So that's scary precedent to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. So uh, getting back to your particular, your areas of interest, you've spoken about the evolution about evolution in careers and adapting to a changing risk and business landscape. You even mentioned learning new skills and embracing machine learning. What sort of changes have you particularly been seeing in the industry, and what skills would someone need to adapt to those changes?
Yeah, good question. So when I think about learning new skills, I always think about, well, where can we build on first, right? So
Hmm.
yes, there are kind of net new things that I think defenders will need to learn. And it's mostly because the more you understand about machine learning and where we are now post deep learning networks, helps you vet the technologies that are coming your way. Because, to be fair, there are a lot of snake oil salespeople and charlatans
Yeah.
coming out with whatever AI features. And you need to be able to reasonably ask hard questions about, how is the model trained? How is data
Right.
segmented? Where does it access our data via API? And you need to have those hard conversations. Otherwise, easy to be fooled. But when you think about
Mm-hmm.
building on your existing knowledge, you take that foundational AI knowledge and you begin to extend it. So, for example, most people tuned in here might be aware of the NIST CSF framework or the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Well, both those organizations have AI frameworks. There's the NIST AI risk management framework, and there is MITRE ATLAS, which is the adversarial threat landscape for AI systems, which is constantly being updated, right? So that's not net new, but it is extending what you are already familiar with and then beginning to examine those frameworks and understand, okay, well, if our business comes to the security team and says, hey, we are looking to build this technology and maybe use our own proprietary large language model, how can you evaluate that risk? You're going to need to be familiar with that framework because the NIST CSF doesn't necessarily correspond to AI technologies. And then I think lastly, it's going to require a pretty substantive change in thinking. So as humans, we have favored specialization, right? You become a pen tester and then a red teamer, and you may be accruing certs along the way. The only reason we've ever done that is because we didn't have machines that could do it. And if you imagine a world in which machines can do a pen test in seconds, or they can threat model in, a few minutes what it took your team previously 1 week or 2 weeks to do, that really requires a change in thinking about your role, not necessarily a one-to-one replacement, but I've been telling people you need to think of your role as changing from one of analysis to one of orchestration. So how do you broaden your learning? And then I would think that means you really need to start talking to your peers. Tell me more about what you do in GRC. Tell me more about how purple teaming works. And you have to sort of see that larger business operational picture because the machines are going to do a lot of the work and you have to be able to move those analyses into the right places and take the right actions.
So would you say that would kind of take the focus away from people getting into specialized, like specializations, or would you say that, and like, kind of becoming more of a generalist? Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that you will start out as a specialist because that's just kind of the way human educational curricula are designed, but you need to keep an eye on cross-functional thinking because the more threaded you get, the more vulnerable you are to simply being replaced. The people who can see the bigger picture and add value as a red teamer in discussions with GRC teams, for example, in discussion with ML engineering teams, those are the people who will succeed in this future. And one of those skills is communication skills. I think, it's natural that we focus on technical skills, but the people who communicate very complex topics quickly across the business will be the ones who hold the keys to the future.
That's really interesting, actually, because you are a big proponent of multidisciplinary thinking. So what are some aspects of other industries or professions that people in InfoSec can learn from?
Yeah, I think if you are just drilling on InfoSec all the time, like you're reading about the latest threat actors, you download APT white papers, I mean, that's great. And it's really good to foster that curiosity and nurture it. But the people who get out of those entry-level positions and succeed up to the VP SecOps, CISO, whatever, are the people who have a broader view of risk in the business. And I think just, off the top of my head, I would think organizational psychology, cognitive science, like how do human users interact with technology? Because those of us in InfoSec interact with technology in a very different way than, say, marketing departments do, salespeople do. But if you are only in network land and you're not thinking about how your peers in the business are operating, you're really doing a disservice to the level of defense you can bring to that organization. And you just really need to think cross-discipline. So you need to be aware of the news. You need to be aware of geopolitical events. You need to be aware of policy stuff. And just kind of ingesting that, whether it's, most people might like to listen to podcasts or maybe they read stuff or they do audiobooks. You just kind of need to make it part of your intellectual diet because then you will begin to start making those connections. If you can't make those connections, you become very vulnerable.
Right. And since you mentioned the cognitive psychology and the cognitive sciences, that sort of thing, I think that would play an even larger role as we get into a more AI driven
Yeah.
sort of age, right? Where, you actually have to learn how to foster relationships within your teams and within your
Mhm.
company, and how to deal with very human related problems when AI is kind of taking care of a lot of the, day to day sort of activities.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think there's an interesting paradox here. So from the
Hmm.
vendor perspective, traditionally we have a concept called the technology adoption curve, right? You have early
Right.
adopters and you work your way up to a majority, and then you get to what are called the laggards, which are the
Hmm.
organizations that are slower to adopt technology. And think
Yep.
of laggards as being like really large organizations where it's very complicated to steer in new directions,
Yeah.
Fortune
Governments.
500
Government.
companies, government, yes, for sure.
Yep.
Now the that curve is out the window, because when you think about the AI development landscape today, the early
Hmm.
adopters can go get open source models today, work in LangChain or Python, Jupyter notebooks. They can begin to assemble stuff today without even having to buy it. Great.
Yeah.
The laggards are kind of having AI pushed on them whether they like it or not. Because if you think about enterprise software, both Google, Microsoft, and Salesforce are just integrating GPT elements into their products natively. So even
Hmm.
if those large enterprises are like, well, we don't have really an AI adoption plan yet, well, you are getting AI pushed into your organization anyway. And
Yeah.
like,
Totally.
what are the security implications of that? Especially something as innocuous as Slack, people are like, oh, it can summarize threads and whatever. Yeah, but Slack is also connected into dozens of your internal apps, your ticketing
Totally.
system,
Mm.
your um, DevOps operations. And so, what are the security implications that come with that? That's something that we really
Yeah.
need to think about.
Oh, that's really interesting. So moving away from the technical side again, into your more of the marketing areas of
Mhm.
interest. Whether it's companies trying to market their products or individuals trying to get noticed for their work, the economy out there is purely attention based. And to get attention, you need to create content. So, what is your personal creative process, whether it's hosting an episode of your podcast or posting on social media?
I have one operating principle, and
Mhm.
is it going to add to the conversation? There are
Yeah.
plenty of people who want to summarize news. I read and hear and listen to and ingest a lot of news, but I early on figured out, like, I'm not the New York Times. So what am I going to bring to the table is going to be a little bit different. And so, for example, since I came from the marketing side and I met a CISO who was also named George, and we kind of had similar gripes, that was a pretty organic idea that,
Mhm.
we have these problems with the industry. How do we address those? So I think be true to your own interests. If you're really into red teaming, you're doing your own infosec research, great. You don't need to necessarily be posting about crypto, right? Or so
Yeah.
what are you doing to add to the conversation rather than just like sharing links? I really hate sharing links without any kind of context or interpretation, because then you're really kind of just a bot and you're not
Yep.
adding your personal point of view. And that goes back to what we said about networking. People will connect with you
Hmm.
as a person, but you got to bring that personhood to the table.
Right.
And you can phrase it like you're asking questions, you can phrase it like you're interrogating this particular idea, but you
Yeah.
just pick those things. I used to talk more about social engineering, but lately it's been AI, it's been diversity, equity, inclusion, and just podcasting in general. So you can pick your
Yep.
topics and you can move with that. But once you decide on that and what you want to talk about and how you want to talk
Yeah.
about it is so much easier than just kind of staring at a blank screen and being like, I want to be
True.
a creator. I don't think that's a really natural way to go about it.
Yeah, in fact, I noticed on some of your LinkedIn posts that you say 100% human generated content, and I've read the entire article. That's I thought that
Yes,
was a pretty
I'm
smart
very
way to put it.
protective of my individual thinking, and so since LinkedIn introduced the like get help with AI, I just think
Yeah.
we now live in an era of synthetic reality. So I just decided to put that disclaimer on my stuff. And if I do create stuff with Midjourney, I make sure that's, very well understood. I just want complete transparency. And in an earlier life, I was doing disinformation research. So I also want you to know any link that I've put out, I have actually read. I don't just sort of like blast links without reading.
That's great, because I read somewhere that I think 70% of the content or posts on social media or content created on the internet is AI generated.
Yes,
and
that's
I think that's probably just gonna get worse over time.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's just all the more reason to stand out, right? Because if you're just
like there's so much more noise.
Yeah, if you're part of the noise, then you're part of the problem.
Yeah, true. So on that note, to my last question, if you had to pick one thing that you will really love about the cybersecurity industry right now, and one thing that you hate about it, what would they be?
Yes, let me start with the negative first, so we don't end on a bummer. I really hate this level of good old boys rampant sexual harassment, and I'm really going to go after it hard. And then, but to what I really love about cyber is it really rewards curiosity. I came into this industry not through a typical path, and I'll say that I've never interviewed anyone that sort of had a straight line into cyber. But if you are curious, if you ask questions, if you put your hand up, it's very rewarding. People explain, they take the time, they show you, they introduce you to other people. And I think that's not true of every industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I found this industry to be so welcoming. I'm not someone from a technical background, and I'm in marketing myself. So that is something that it makes it easier to feel at home and to kind of feel like you want to come back, right? Because especially in Black Hat, I made so many new friends, and I genuinely feel like I would want to come back there and meet those people again, because they want the same thing as me, to form good relationships and to just have a good time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, that's great. Thanks for this. Thanks for joining us on this Friday Fireside Chat, George. This was a great, chat. I always look forward to meeting new guests, and this was a really good conversation. So thanks for that.
Yes, thank you. Really good questions, and glad to be here.
Yeah. So to our viewers, I'd like to remind you that before you log off, that we do have that giveaway running right now, the AppSecEngineer Pro bundle. It's the entire library of AppSecEngineer courses, challenges, and playgrounds, all in one license, one subscription, and it's a giveaway to one lucky user. So in the description, you will find a Google form where you can share your details with us, and we will announce that in the next Friday Fireside Chat. So look forward to that. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See ya.